This weekend, I had the pleasure of seeing one of the biggest surprises of the year in the movie theater for me, and that film is Pressure. With 60 hours until the scheduled D-Day, Group Captain James Stagg has the astronomical task of advising General Eisenhower on whether or not to move forward with the invasion. This film is perfect at conveying a sense of urgency and holding your attention, but what are my full thoughts on the film? Grab your popcorn and let's dive into Pressure. The film follows Group Captain James Stagg advising General Eisenhower on the timing of D-Day because the weather would have disastrous consequences on the invasion. James Stagg is this individual who comes from Britain who has been advised by Churchill as the best meteorologist in the United Kingdom. So essentially, this guy is really good and he's going to advise Eisenhower about the timing of D-Day. And if they were to move forward with this invasion, thousands of troops would die to waves and capsizing ships, aircraft can't see, and ground troops wouldn't make it ashore if the weather were to be bad. So that's why they need the weather to be absolutely perfect for this invasion. And that's something that this film does a really great job at capturing. If they were to postpone this invasion, the Nazis would be ready for the invasion and they could potentially lose the whole war. So there's this really interesting dilemma of postpone or move forward. How does the weather affect everything? And for James Stagg, that's his job to tell Eisenhower what's going to happen, how's the weather going to be. And it's a really interesting side of the war because the meteorology is not something that's often thought about or taught in schools. I know I didn't learn about the consequences of the weather going into this film. I had no idea what to expect from this movie because it's about weather, right? It could be really boring, it could be really great, but this film does a really great job at making the weather seem interesting and making everything have stakes to it and tension. The timing of this movie is also great. He starts 60 hours before the invasion of Normandy, and this really conveys the urgency, and the music does a great job at tying this in, where all of the music is really tense, really fast-paced, and anytime there's a decision that has to be made, the music just cuts out, so you feel that tension, like what's the decision that's going to be made? How is James Stagg going to react to this? How is Eisenhower going to react to this? All of these decisions that are made in the film are really, really well done, and you can really feel the urgency. You're on the edge of your seat the whole time. The central conflict in the entire movie comes from the disagreements from the British side and the American side of the meteorology unit. You got Colonel Crick versus Group Captain Stagg, and the fact that they're misaligned really adds to the stakes. They could get this done a lot faster if they collaborate, but you've got Stagg, who is this hardened individual, I'm going to follow the facts, this is what we need to do. And you've got Crick, who's this individual who is very established, he's an old timer, he's got all of the forecasts right in the past, so why would Eisenhower have any reason to distrust him? But Eisenhower trusts Churchill in that Stagg is going to be the right person for this job. So it's really interesting how they have conflicts throughout the movie, and eventually there's a moment of victory in the start of the third act for Stagg, and Crick is devastated. It relieves the tension, and the movie could have really ended there, and it would have been a satisfying resolution, but it keeps going, and it adds little details after that make the movie that much better. The audience is still holding their breath as these two men are fighting and working together. Are they going to resolve? Is this going to be a good place for the Allies to invade? But we already know how the movie ends because of history, but it holds you on the edge of your seat. You still think that, oh, maybe this is a bad idea, maybe the Allies aren't going to win. But that's what the movie does such a great job of. Overall, I'd give this movie a 4.5 stars for plot. It's a great idea, it's great execution. One thing I noticed is that it can get a little boring when discussing the nuances of weather, and that really depends on your technical background. Sometimes some people will feel like, oh, this is a bunch of gibberish to me, and be drawn out of the film. As someone who comes from a technical background, I really enjoyed that part of the film, but it can get repetitive of talking about the weather all the time. The characters in this film are still really great, but I think this is the aspect of the film where it falters a little bit. I would have liked more time with the teams behind Crick and Stagg, these little side characters that are kind of essentially the lab rats doing the work, gathering the data, analyzing things, and reporting to the superior. Crick is the manager, essentially. He's still doing work, and Stagg is also the manager. They're still doing work and agreeing on a decision, but they have lots of people under them who are reporting to them and gathering data and analyzing, and these characters aren't really developed. I don't really know their names, so I would have liked a little more time with them. And then you can see how Crick and Stagg differ in their leadership styles from the point of view of the people working under them. You kind of see that in what you observe in Crick and Stagg's actions, but I would have liked to have the people under them discuss that and think about, hey, this is why Crick is well liked. This is why we don't like Stagg. And Stagg even comes in later. He's like, yeah, I know you guys don't like me, but I would have liked to see how the men felt about Stagg, how the men felt about Crick, and the comparison between the two. One of the things that this film does a good job is Brendan Fraser is great as Eisenhower. He's very commanding and imposing in a figure that's really hard to play. Fraser has been quoted saying, "Oh, you want me to play Ike? Like, that's a hard job. That's a hard task." And he does a great job. Eisenhower is commanding in his scenes. You feel the urgency that he commands as well as his responsibility. But I did notice that some of the scenes where Eisenhower is yelling, being a big military guy in this room full of military people who are yelling at Crick or Stagg, especially earlier in the film, are a bit choppy. He speaks like this. Like, you know, how the words are very separated. That's not typically how a normal person would yell, but he eases up a little bit later on the film when he has scenes where he has to yell, and it feels more natural and more flowed. So I think he was probably a little nervous at the start in these early scenes that he filmed and kind of eased into it a little more, and then the director didn't really decide to refilm those scenes later on when he was already used to playing the role. But overall, I think he does a great job as Eisenhower. And some of the scenes in this movie, you have foot soldiers singing and dancing, telling us why should we care about why people die, why are there more stakes to this film. And of course we care because they're young soldiers that are fighting for the right against evil, and we know that these guys are the good guys because we know how history works. We know that the Nazis are evil, but of course the movie has to show that itself. You can't really rely on the goodwill of your audience to build empathy for characters that you haven't developed. And singing and dancing humanizes the soldiers in the movie itself. They do a really good job at that. And it also humanizes them for Group Captain Stagg. Like, James Stagg looks at these people singing and dancing, and he's like, oh, these are the people whose lives are on the line. These are the people who I'm in charge of deciding whether or not they live or die. And that really adds to the stakes of the decision, and it adds to the whole suspense of the film. My favorite character in this film is Carrie Condon's Kay Summersby. She portrays what it's like to be a woman in a male field in the 1940s perfectly. She's kind of demeaned as a secretary. She's only important for setting up meetings and isn't allowed to speak. Her opinion is dismissed a lot of times, but she's the only character that understands the human elements of what Stagg is under. She pushes him to get the job done, but she also understands that he has a pregnant wife. Like, no one else in the film is considering the fact that Stagg is under a whole lot of stress, and there's something that happens in the middle of the film where it's like, oh, this changes the way Stagg behaves drastically. Carrie Condon's character understands that and is able to communicate with him and communicate with Eisenhower. And while the men care about the results, she cares about the humanity of James Stagg and understands his emotions. So for me, that's really why she's my favorite character in the film. Then, of course, you have the central two main meteorologists. They do a really good job at contrasting the way that these men behave. James Stagg is miserable and unlikable, but smart, and Crick is the guy that everyone likes and the old-timer, and he's relying on history versus James Stagg is relying on data, and you kind of see the contrast there throughout the film. Often, the new guy can provide value in real life. This kind of mirrors a lot of situations you see in the workplace, like in your job. There's a new guy that comes in and tries to say a bunch of things, and the old-timer's like, no, that's how we've always done it. But sometimes the way that you've always done it is not necessarily the right way. And that's true in this film and also true in real life. And I really liked how the movie added to that and portrayed an example of what really is a corporate meeting, corporate workplace. I got a lot out of that as someone who has worked in corporate environments. Of course, eventually these two men have to put aside their differences to work together for the betterment of the Allied forces, which is a really compelling arc. You see how James Stagg compromises and how Crick compromises and how they come together to end up deciding on the timing of D-Day. And some of the best moments in the entire film are when Stagg finally concedes to Crick, given new evidence, and Crick finally agrees with Stagg on certain things, and they come together and they push for D-Day to be on a certain date. Of course, we know that that's June 6th, but the way that these men are both trying to be high performers that further their careers, but they have to concede their pride slightly to win out overall, to win the war. That's really compelling. So I would give 3.5 stars for the characters. There are some flaws in Fraser's performance, especially at the start of the film, but he really eases into the role of Eisenhower towards the end of the movie and does a great job overall. And I would have liked to see more development of the crews under each of the meteorologists, but I still think that this film has fantastic characters. Really, for the pacing of this film, I could not think of a better paced film. It holds you on the edge of your seat the entire time, and you feel the tension constantly. But the film does a great job of having some moments of reprieve to the tension. And there are conversations that are sprinkled in throughout the film. And they give us details into a character's life and motivation while also easing the tension to keep the audience engaged. If you have too much tension for the entire movie, it's like a heart attack, basically. You're sitting on the edge of your seat and it's never relieved. Like, that's not good for audience retention. That's not good for entertainment because you feel stressed while you're watching a movie. You don't want to feel stressed while you're watching a movie. You want to feel just enough tension that it pulls you along. You want to see how the movie's resolved, but you're not feeling anxious or stressed while watching the movie. And this does a great job at that because it has these little conversations that relieve the tension while also providing important information to the audience. And the music is great in this regard. I already mentioned that briefly, but the music is so tense, so high-paced, so fast, and it will cut out for important decisions, and that really shows, oh no, what's going to happen? You don't know how this meeting is going to go. Ultimately, you do know how the film ends, but what is the interim steps? What happens in between the scheduling of D-Day and the actual attack? And that's really interesting. This film gets a 5 stars for pacing. It holds you on the edge of your seat the whole time, and it never feels a moment too long or too short. And I can't think of a better paced film in recent years for achieving what it is trying to do. For the visuals in this film, they're pretty good. There's nothing to set this film apart in terms of visuals. I think it's a lot of just office and dreary gray and rain. It's kind of unappealing to look at because it's a film about the weather, and you understand that there's going to be miserable rainy scenes and you're going to be indoors a lot. These people are trapped inside of this confined area, so there's not a whole lot of scenes to look at because it's a super secret military operation. They can't leave the base, so it's very hard to get a wide variety of visuals in that regard. The film intercuts to old-timey shots of war. I think these are either replicas or authentic shots of ships in the 1940s and planes in the 1940s. Anytime there's a war scene, it'll cut to these authentic shots of actual people, actual soldiers, actual ships. I thought that was really cool. It gets some bonus points for changing the visual style, and you can tell yeah, this is not filmed in 2026. This is filmed way back in the 40s, or at least is edited to make it look like it was filmed back in the 40s. So for that, it gets some bonus points in the visuals. For a film about weather, I would have liked more shots of the weather, clouds, storms. Again, most of the shots are indoors. They aren't inherently interesting. And most of the weather shots are looking through a window at sun or rain. You don't really see the formation of these storms like I would have expected from a film about meteorology. I would have liked to see some more actual shots of clouds or rain or weather forming or wind patterns, all of that. But it's still very interesting overall. There aren't many shots of the actual war in this film, but when they show up, I thought they were fantastic. Some of the best shots in this film. There's blood in the water all the time. They start with this Operation Crimson Tiger, which is just this brutal massacre of men. There's blood everywhere, and it really shows the urgency, the stakes. Like, the way that they focus on death all the time in the war, it adds urgency, and you really question, like, oh, are the Allies going to succeed? Again, we know they're going to win, but the way that this film is structured makes it really hard to believe that and adds to the tension of the film. I would give it 3.5 stars on visuals. Nothing blew me away, but the shots of the authentic war footage were really cool. I would have liked more scenes of the weather, personally. For entertainment value, there's not a whole lot to say in this category. I personally was thoroughly entertained, but I also wouldn't put it close to one of the most entertaining films ever. As an engineer who likes data, I enjoyed the weather talk. I think it can get too much for casual audiences, though, and if you are not someone from a technical field, you might enjoy this film less. The third act really carries the entertainment. It is way more tense than the rest of the film, and we got the best scenes in the movie in the third act, in my opinion. The first 2 acts are still really good, but I can understand why they might bore some people because it is largely just office, people talking in an office and meetings and corporate meetings, and it's a military setting, so it's a little different than like corporate meetings, but it's still like meetings and office talk and development of the plan and how this plan is going to go forward. It's not as good as Oppenheimer, but that's what I would compare this film to. If you liked Oppenheimer with a lot of science and talk and sit-down office scenes, you probably also would like this film, but keep in mind that this is definitely not as good quality of a film as Oppenheimer, so that might detract from your enjoyment also. I think the way that you enjoy this film ultimately depends a lot on your profession and what you've chosen to do in life. If you're like a working man or blue collar and you don't have a lot of experience with the corporate world or meetings, you probably won't get as much out of this film. There's lots of things in this film that I could relate to my office jobs that I've had, and if you haven't had an office job, you might not get some of the comparisons that they're trying to make. I would give this film 4 stars in entertainment. I really enjoyed it, but it definitely wasn't the most entertaining film ever. The value you get out of the film depends on your profession. So overall, I thought this movie was really solid, especially as someone who comes from a science and engineering background. As I've said, I think your enjoyment of this film really depends heavily on your background. If you're a historian, scientist, engineer, military, ex-military, I think you will really enjoy this movie. If you're from a less technical background or do blue-collar work, you may enjoy this movie less. Everyone, I think, will get something different from this movie and enjoy it for different reasons, and that's part of the reason why I think this movie is a great movie. It lands at a 4 stars overall, and I personally give it an 8.5 out of 10. It's probably going to end up on my top 5 movies of the year, and definitely will end up on my top 10. It really depends how the rest of the movies throughout the year perform. There are a lot of heavy hitters lined up for this year, especially this summer. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and leaving a like down below. Comment your experience with this movie and your profession. Did you agree with this review? And as always, remember to keep consuming media so I can keep coming.